Okay, welcome everybody to this webinar with the Right Honourable Claire O'Neill. Many of you will remember as Claire Perry, as she then was the Member of Parliament for Devizes in Wiltshire and a Minister in the May government. And she's going to speak about COP26 and the opportunities for the European centre-right with the Green Agenda. As always, I'd say to anybody who wants to ask a question after Claire has given her introductory remarks, that please use the Q&A facility. And you don't have to wait for Claire to finish to start typing your questions in there. I will go through the list. I will try to call people if I can so that you could put the question to Claire directly. If I could remind everybody, please, you may need to unmute yourself. Please make sure when you've asked your question, you are muted again, otherwise we can get some interference. The webinar is being recorded and it will be uploaded to the CEF website. So this is being treated as on the record. Claire is the Managing Director for Climate and Energy and Natural Climate Solutions for the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and is Senior Advisor for Energy and Climate to Public Policy Projects, PPP. She was MP for Devizes from 2010 to 2019 and this country's Minister of State for Climate Change and Energy at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy for 2 years. She persuaded the Cabinet, I remember the meeting very, very vividly, to push the bid for to host the UN Climate Change Conference, the COP26, and without giving secrets away, not everybody around the cabinet table was instantly persuaded, but Claire's diplomacy and command of arguments won through. And she served as COP26 president designate until 2020. Before coming into politics, she worked for the Bank of America and for McKinsey's and Credit Suisse, and then started her own small business offering online financial advice to women. So Claire, you are very welcome and you're very much among friends this evening. I suspect you will probably find certain people in the audience. Yes. But please, the floor is yours and we look forward to hearing what you have to say.
David, thank you so much. And thank you for a very long introduction. Goodness, I'd sort of forgotten half those things. Absolute pleasure to be with the group tonight. And thank you so much for the invitation. And obviously this is, this sort of question of COP26 and sustainability and what politicians should be doing, what business is doing. I mean, the temperature gauge on this stuff is running pretty hot in most countries. And so I thought what I'd do is make just a few remarks about the sort of general situation and then try and draw it back to our shared agenda, where I think there is a massive opportunity for the sort of conservative centre right to really own this. And I think actually it's really vital that we are much more involved and much more in command of the situation. And I'll remark on that why. And please do feel free, it'd be great to get some questions. So sort of five things. I've been taught, there was a wonderful man called Sir Roger Gifford who recently passed away, who did a huge amount for green finance in the City of London. He was a great friend and mentor. And he always said you must start speeches with the positive. So let me start, and actually it's quite hard to start with the positive if you spend your life looking at climate, because those of you who are followers of this will know that carbon dioxide levels in the atmosphere as measured by the Keeling curve, the daily measurement of CO2, suggests that our CO2 levels are the highest they've been for 4.5 million years now. And, truly we are in quite unprecedented territory in terms of what is happening to an atmospheric layer that is 60 miles deep at most, where it is exceptionally difficult to deal with the ultimate tragedy of the commons, which is, this is an intergenerational problem, this is a spatial problem, and we have very weak global levers to try and form any form of alliance to attack this. I mean, the Montreal Protocol is often held up as what originally kickstarted this whole thing, this kind of climate diplomacy. It started the UN process. The difference is solving for chlorofluorocarbons in refrigeration was quite simple, and we weren't suggesting to countries that they needed to radically change their aspirations for energy, for example, for all of their citizens. So it is very difficult. Having said all that, the positive is this, that this whole zero carbon reduction agenda it has just an unstoppable momentum now. I now work in the sort of business space and in the financial space, and you know, every large corporate, including its enormous supply chains, bankers, investors, are now focused on how do we develop a landing zone that hits us at net zero for 2050 or sooner. How do we align, by the way, with not just being climate positive, but nature positive? And also, how do we include sort of equity, both in the workplace and our supply chains in that? And so there is this extraordinary momentum that is building, and sustainability has really gone mainstream. And interestingly, you know, the geopolitics of this are, so the EU, sorry, the UK and actually Germany, and then our broader EU gang have very much been on the leaderboard of decarbonisation, really starting in sort of 1990 and continuing onwards. The US is now back at the table, which is having welcome effects in this sort of global porridge that is global climate diplomacy. And you saw, the G7, whilst being short on action, at least being very long on ambition. So starting again to take this into the mainstream of the political discourse. But the second point I wanted to make is that collaboration is key. And it's quite extraordinary to me that, you know, people assume that the climate is a sort of government to solve agenda. You know, we're so focused on the COP26 process, which is a conversation amongst governments. And in fact, really a conversation amongst officials. I mean, the COP process is very much run by negotiators who nominally report to usually environmental ministers, but the negotiators in many cases have been in post for 25 years. And my experience was they run pretty independently from the supposed ministers to whom they report. The ministers have quite a poor grasp of what's actually going on. So this is very much a G to G process upon which everyone assumes amazing things are going to happen. Well, they don't. I mean, Paris was an absolute high point of diplomacy, partly because the French government threw everything at it, including deals on sales of fighter jets to India, including personal interventions between then John Kerry and President Modi and Bill Gates. I mean, it was a full court effort. And that's what governments have to do to achieve even the lowest result. And Paris was a high point in 26 years of diplomacy, or actually 21 at that point. But actually, in terms of what it really set out, it was a pretty soft series of commitments that were put on there. Nothing mandating, nothing that is legally binding. And isn't it bizarre that we assume that governments uniquely in this space will take care of business, whereas in fact we all know that you need a really strong public and private partnership in order to deliver progress in this. And actually politically, you don't just need national governments, you need local governments, state governments involved as well. There are really big roles for city mayors, for state governments, for regional governments to get involved, and actually they are often much closer to the implementation action than a central government coming up with pledges and progress. So the collaborative requirement in this to really, set targets together, to set objectives together, to trust different groups to come together is absolutely huge. And of course, collaboration cross-border is really important. I think we're not going to get into the EU and the Brexit debate, but having sat in Europe during several of the conversations in the EU representing the UK, where we were talking about phase out of fossil fuel vehicles, reductions in emissions, it was quite clear that we exist in an ecosystem where we can collaborate to advance our overall progress. And so that sense, I think, of we're all in this together is so hugely important. The third thing to raise is that targets are good, but near-term deliverable practical action is much better. So we're in a kind of race of target setting now, where countries are being urged to set their net zero by 2050 targets. Companies are being asked to join the Race to Zero campaign and similarly get this net zero number out there. That's good, because actually even 2 years ago, net zero was considered quite a sort of dirty word, because it implied that we couldn't reduce to absolute zero. We had to remove as well. About a third of the emissions we need to take away come from actual carbon removal. And we know that politically that can be quite difficult in some countries. But always we need to ask ourselves, why are we doing this? How are we doing it? What's the mechanism for doing it? How are we going to, yes, it's okay to legislate for net zero. I was the minister who sort of brought that whole net zero by 2050 to the fore in the UK. That's great. But what are the real mechanisms? And the challenge is, again, at the governmental level, we often lack kind of governance and scrutiny mechanisms to make sure that countries are on track. And we all know that for politicians, words are easy, and often delivery is left to the next government that's coming in. Interestingly, the role of the financial sector in this space is hugely important. So what we're seeing is, whether it's central banks or government or banking regulators, or indeed private financial institutions and investors getting involved, there is a real sense now that that is one of the mechanisms that is holding us to account, not just the long term, but actually what are the practical deliverable steps along the way, and that is to be absolutely encouraged. The fourth thing is the sort of just transition element around this, which can express itself in how do you actually deliver an energy transition that is fair to the large numbers of people who are employed, for example, in coal extraction, or in communities that rely on a so-called dirty power system for their livelihoods, all the way down to how do we think about overseas development assistance that actually benefits people on the ground. And we don't spend enough time talking about that. The German example actually of committing to phase out coal by 2038, I think it will be sooner, but really thinking hard about what that transition package looked like for the people in the coal producing parts of the country was super important. I mean, I wouldn't recommend the UK's way of phasing out coal, which was to pick a massive political fight, 40 years ago. It didn't work so well. But we have to face up to these challenges, and increasingly, as you get the developing world's conversation into this, this constant refrain about how does this look like for us is so important. And that brings me to my last point, really, which is that the solutions have got to be ruthlessly practical. And in this space that I've now been enjoying, working in for even before I came into politics, but and since, there is so much what we call in England kind of pie in the sky thinking. People seem to want to start with the world as they would wish it to be, rather than as they actually find it. And there's a weird sense almost of, I call it kind of energy imperialism, that is entering into the debate. So we assume that every country in the world should go through the decarbonisation trajectory of the UK, where we drove coal out of the system very substantially through political means 40 years ago. We then had a very rapid push out of coal from 2010 onwards. Coal, when I was elected in 2010, was 40% of the UK's energy generation mix. It's now nothing. And that was done, A, by bringing in lots of gas, and B, by starting to switch on lots of renewables. And yet, if you speak to the global commentariat about what the energy transition looks like for other countries, particularly in the developing world, you will hear that no country should be permitted to use gas. This is a terrible thing. And then it just sits incredibly badly when you're looking at the continent of Africa, where almost 1 billion people have no access to energy at all, let alone clean energy. And so there is this really sort of strange desire to be incredibly ideological about the solution, rather than actually focus on the world as we find it. And my second favourite example of ideology driving out practicalism, and I hope this isn't a difficult point to make if we have German colleagues on, but the German decision to phase out nuclear was crackers from an energy transition point of view, because Germany ended up rather dramatically increasing its coal burning. And I was telling David in a group on Friday, the COP in Bonn in when was that, 3 years ago, we were meeting in the old Parliament buildings, and we were treated to the sight of extraordinarily loaded barges of very dirty coal sailing past on the way to power the German energy systems. Basically a sort of 2 fingers up to all these global climate activists. That was a bad, impractical decision. And this is why I think it is absolutely a great opportunity and the right thing to do to get the sort of so-called centre-right involved in this debate, because we have to be business focused. We have to accept that the private sector, as was shown in COVID, can deliver extraordinary results if unleashed to do so. And that is very much at the heart, I think, of all of our agendas. And we have to constantly challenge this argument that, you know, let's start with the Greta Thunberg view of reality. And I've met dear Greta. I mean, she's a wonderful campaigner, but she has, you know, she's just clueless about what the world really looks like. Let's start with the reality and then work out what we can do very rapidly with that existing situation. So I think this opportunity to be pro-business, pro-collaboration, ruthlessly pragmatic, and to deal with this extraordinary global crisis we are facing using facts and figures and a sort of sober approach to solutions is the way to go. And then, having said all that, I don't want anyone to think that we can be complacent. I mean, whether or not we like it, we are on a burning platform that doesn't appear yet to be crackling around the edges for many of us. But, you know, be in no doubt, the last time CO2 levels were this high, the world was 4 degrees warmer, sea levels were 20 meters higher, and there were beech forests growing on the South Pole. And as a species that has only been in a settled agrarian system for the last 5,000 years, we're going to be facing challenges the like of which we have not seen collectively. And it will raise not just questions of our own country's ability to adapt to a very different world, but the whole question of migration, of what fair looks like in a world where essentially 2 billion people can't feed themselves because of climate change. These are political questions to which we don't yet have answers. And so we're going to have to really put our heads together to come up with solutions to much bigger challenges and questions than I think we have seen even during COVID. I'll stop there, David. Very happy to take any questions or challenges to that. Can't hear you, David. Still can't hear you, David.
That's it.
There we go.
I take my own advice and mute while someone is speaking. I was so enraptured by listening to you that I forgot to unmute. But let me use Sharon's privilege before I come to questions from others attending. And you mentioned our mutual friend Roger Gifford, who is a great friend of the Conservative European Forum and indeed spoke to us about green finance late last year. I got the sense sometimes talking to Roger, and I've picked up from other leading businessmen and women, is that actually the private sector is in some ways getting ahead of the politicians in certainly some Western countries in seeing how things are going with the carbon agenda and zero carbon technology and adaptation of industries. Is that a view you share?
Yes, very strongly, David. And interested, the World Business Council for Sustainable Development, which has been around for 26 years, has always been the place where the world's most sustainable businesses go to, solve these big problems. I mean, if you listen to the leading members, their embracing of the problem, their real genuine whole of company leadership on this. There's a point where bonuses are paid on sustainability goals and real sustainability goals, not greenwashing ones. The sort of absolute mania to be both climate positive but nature positive, and then to focus on equity. It's real and it's tangible and it's almost evangelical. It's amazing and it's inspiring, and I think partly because the challenges are so complex from a whole of government point of view. Governments tend to just be, and I speak, as you know, from the UK government's perspective, where I thought we were wildly ambitious, but it's really tough to deliver because you have to orchestrate that is really difficult. But there is no question that the private sector is wanting to do this, and also to form alliances to do it better, to form sort of coalitions of the willing to do it better. And that, for me, is something that we should be embracing and encouraging.
Thank you. Nicholas McLean, and then I will come after Nicholas to Tim Skeet when you've answered Nicholas's question.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that marvellous introduction. Uh, I wanted to ask whether you thought the policy of global Britain carries a really heavy carbon footprint, maximizing our trade with faraway countries like Australia, rather than our closest neighbors in the EU, just to bring in Brexit. And and if I could also ask an unrelated, very short question, do you think COP26 will give a platform for putting digital currencies in the dock, like Bitcoin, given their vast use of electricity?
They're both great questions. And so the short answer to the second question is no. I think that one of the things we don't do is look at the carbon pools. And actually, Tim, truthfully, I think despite the headlines, if you actually looked at current digital mining CO2 generation, it would be a big number in absolute terms, but it would be dwarfed, for example, by coal growth in China. So I think you have to sort of focus where the big pools are. But it's a good question to ask because, again, interestingly, the companies who are most anti-fossil fuels tend to be the digital companies. They refuse to get into alliances, for example, with the fossil fuel companies. And then you look at sort of some of these tech practices which don't sit very well with that. I think the trade question is absolutely fascinating, and I mean, look, the Australian trade deal is minute, right, in terms of what it's actually going to deliver in terms of global trade and therefore CO2 emissions. The broader opportunity to use trade as one of the few tools we have to get into the China conversation, which I just saw was posted, is enormous. And we have conversations now about carbon adjusted border taxes, where, for example, you would start to influence the use of coal in China to generate steel by, effectively taxing that. Now, of course, there's questions about protectionism, and of course, you've got to have industries that are prepared to modernize rather than just sit behind, decades of underinvestment. But it is a great tragedy for me that this trade opportunity, which I think smart people in government still get, is being completely subsumed in the fervour for, free trade deals. And I know the EU is doing work on this, and I know Biden has sort of been looking at it. And I just think the UK voice, that there's a real problem, right? Because on the one hand, they want to sign up. Yes, we've got new post-Brexit trade deals, marvellous. And the last thing they'd want to do is offset those. But it is a huge missed opportunity. And the truth of it is, whether it's the EU or the UK, our emissions are tiny compared to the emissions coming out of the US, China, and India. And we just don't have political or economic, or we don't have political levers to get into that space. But what we do have is supply chains and trade levers, and we have to use them.
Thank you, Tim Skeet, and then after Tim, I'll call Malcolm Harbour.
Hello, good evening. Nice to see you here, Claire. Just the usual one. It's always me asking these two questions, but one, what does a consistent China policy look like, given that they really, really are important? And I spent my whole day working on issues around China. And the second, I was going to simply ask, is the financial community doing enough? Do we need more banking or insurance regulation to kind of push them along the way? It was a similar question I asked dear old Sir Roger when he appeared, and he, of course, is greatly missed by all of us.
Yeah, indeed. And Tim, actually, you should probably be giving this talk, not me, because I suspect your insights in your role about the influence of finance in China would be compelling. So the truth of it is, we have to work out ways ideally through collaboration to get China to move. And what I'm told is that actually the central banking system in China, and I'd love to get your view on this, is in the mix, is starting to understand this issue about climate risk, is starting to talk about pricing it. The challenge is that, as Brexit trade deals are the imperative for the UK, post-COVID growth is the imperative for China, and the growth in coal. So China is the country that is, I set up the Powering Past Coal Alliance, which was a great way of countries coming together to phase out coal. The challenge is, of course, that China's using coal not just for energy, but also for industrial production, because regional governors are under the cosh to up production levels, and that is the real challenge. But there is no, I think for me, you have to look at, what are the global levers that we can pull? So we haven't got a legally binding global framework. So the Paris Agreement is, is voluntary, at best. We've got some elements of trade, and there is a big question about the World Trade Organization and what more they can do. And I have high hopes for the new WTO leader. I think she's very good, but again, it's historically not been impactful. We can have regional cross-border adjustment policies, but the true sort of universal impact or influence is the financial system, and whether it's listing regulations in particular stock exchanges or stress testing, applied by central banks and or private institutions. That for me feel, that bank financiers are good at discounting risk, of coming up with the net present value of risk. And I, in fact, got Mark Carney involved in the COP process, and he's been fantastic in driving this agenda. And I think for me, I'm hopeful that is one of the ways to unlock it. The challenge is, of course, that there are some parts of many economies, whether it's state-owned oil and gas companies or national development banks that are marching to a different agenda, where the climate question is just not featuring. But, surely we should be able to price that, whether you're looking at, credit default swap rates or not. We should be able to price the climate risk of these countries in a fairly rational and comparable way. So yes, I do think there is a big role for finance. But Tim, I can ask you, is your sense that the Bank of China is sort of getting climate, perhaps more in a way than the politicians or the regional growth drivers?
Well, actually, let me take the opportunity to say absolutely yes. And in fact, I have fresh insights even as of today. Part of the problem we have with China, if I can put it in these terms, is that communications is not necessarily their strong spot. And they're very good at communicating with their own people, but they haven't really got to a point where they're good at communicating sometimes outside. And there's a lot of messaging being lost. One of the fascinating things about coal is that the banking system is already reducing its exposure to coal, use of coal in energy production and other energy intensive industries. And that's already happening, but it's not being flagged very publicly at this point in time. I suspect as we move towards COP26, we'll hear a lot more about that. But I can say that there's a tremendous amount of coordination of policy between all the big nations involved, and China, to my understanding, is playing a very full role. They're introducing more regulations there than we're seeing here in Europe, and they take it very, very seriously. When you can't breathe in Beijing, it tells you something, and I think the government has made it very, very clear that they need to take action. And we all know that when the government decides something, it's going to happen, and they've committed to net zero by 2016, so on. So it is fascinating. The question really in my mind is, they're very committed to doing it, and I think that is genuine. It's a big country with a massive economy, and you're right, there's a lot of coal-fired power stations still. But the rate at which they make changes is extraordinary. We can't discount that.
And just to throw into the mix, the demand signals from China, for example, in the electric vehicle market, not so much four-wheelers, but sort of 2- and 3-wheelers, is absolutely huge. And so you can have these, as was done with solar panels, these extraordinary changes in pricing based on massive adoption in the country, and that is to be welcomed. And thank you also for pointing out the air quality. The sort of co-benefits of climate improvement can often be very physical as well. So that is another way to campaign.
Thank you. Thank you, Tim. After Malcolm Harbour, who's next, I shall call Peter Dawson. Malcolm.
Thank you very much, Claire, for a very clear exposition. I was in the European Parliament for 15 years, and I'm one of the few engineers in elected politics. So I want to ask you a bit about technology.
Please.
And I agree very much with your emphasis about designing total systems and not sort of picking on individual activities. So for me, it seems one of the biggest challenges that we haven't yet got any convinced solution is over carbonising aspects of transport. Electric is all right for lightweight vehicles, but it's no good for goods vehicle transport or for aviation, or indeed for domestic boilers. And it seems to me that we're going to have to find some ways of using natural gas and converting it in a zero carbon way into hydrogen. But I think that inevitably is going to involve carbon capture, which does seem to be unpopular with certain green lobbies.
Yes, it does.
But it seems to me that this is a challenge, a global challenge, at that stage of developing technology. And we're not necessarily looking for countries to hog that technology, but actually to pool their resources to come up with some solutions.
Thank you, and thank you. I know from your background, you know a lot about light vehicles. Thank you for raising it. And so you're absolutely right. So, one of the key questions is, how do you decarbonize? Not so much light vehicle transport, where although there are companies like Toyota who are still convinced there is a future for hydrogen, and that's fine, it always seems a bit crazy to me to go to the energy cost of creating hydrogen in order to then, electrify to use in vehicles, when actually it's quite easy to electrify light transport. As you say, the challenge is for heavier duty transport, heavy mid-tier freight, trains, and also potentially shipping, where hydrogen has a role to play. The challenge at the moment is that hydrogen is being seen as a wonder molecule. So it also links back to the previous Tim's point, because actually China is making several big bets in hydrogen because it's seen as a way of decarbonising heavy industry, which is very reliant on coal. And so we have lots of organizations coming together, the European Hydrogen Council, various global hydrogen initiatives, essentially saying, how do we make low cost green hydrogen? And low cost is key because at the moment this is out of the money by a factor of about 10, and also we don't have the ability to scale up renewables to create the level of hydrogen that we need. So again, there's a bit of wishful thinking. One of the questions that's a really interesting one that's never asked, I don't think, is about nuclear and hydrogen. So if you're really genuinely interested in producing low carbon hydrogen, then it seems to me that nuclear is a very sensible way to do it. And of course, again, there's lots, as you pointed out, lots of ideology around this, and also carbon capture and storage, which I find the most incredible opportunity, partly because the UK has access to all of these reservoirs under the North Sea, which we took the hydrocarbons out, which are sitting perfect to permanently sequester carbon. But again, I'm told in some parts of the world, the US and Germany in particular, CCS as it's called, is very unpopular. People don't like this idea. And again, I don't think we have the luxury of these choices. Sitting around trying to decide what perfect looks like before we do stuff is not compatible with the current climate levels. So the good news is there's lots of good engineering thinking going on about CCS and hydrogen and how you might bring them together. And I think we will start to see some big announcements. And to their credit, the UK government has come out with hydrogen as part of its 10-point plan, albeit with quite small amounts of money. Some other countries, particularly Germany, have come out with big hydrogen strategies. And interestingly, Namibia and Chile have also announced they want to be regional hydrogen hubs because they actually have, very cheap renewables there. So this is being seen as a big global opportunity to be engineered into the solution, but not nuclear, which I find odd.
Am I allowed to comment briefly?
Please.
Pleased you reminded me about nuclear, because at least 10 years ago, when I was in the European Parliament, I had discussions with what was then called AREVA, but anyway, the French Nuclear Engineering Consortium, about the possibility of doing this, which they were very keen on. But I mean, unfortunately, things got mad with actually sorting out some of their new reactor technology. But I think it would be great if we put that back on the agenda, because I think that's very promising indeed. And if you need to engineer a special purpose reactor to do this, and this would be a really powerful way of creating zero carbon hydrogen.
Yep. And usually China, of course, is still continuing to build out nuclear and potentially export it. So again, in a country which is beset with practicality, it seems like a solution. I'm a little tiny plug for PPP, which some of you will be involved in, holding a nuclear round table in a few weeks' time, and really with companies like EDF and a lot of the countries who are using nuclear, really starting to explore this question in more detail. Why are we not talking about this, and where are the opportunities?
Thank you very much indeed, and thanks, Malcolm. I'm going to go to Peter Dawson, and after Peter, Elaine Robinson.
Thank you, David. Can you hear?
Yes.
Hello.
Yeah, great. Hello, Claire. Thank you for a fascinating sort of insight so far of some of the issues facing us all. Can I bring it right back to very local? I'm
Yes.
a councillor in Wandsworth.
Oh, well done.
And like many authorities, we declared a climate emergency in 2019, carbon neutral by 2030, zero carbon by 2050. We're now in the middle of working through action plans to try and achieve all that. One of the big issues in specific area, we have a housing stock which the council runs of 32,000 homes, because we've never sort of got rid of them to private or to housing operators, etc. About half of those are leaseholders. So looking at dealing with energy efficiency, power going forward in domestic premises can be quite a fraught process of convincing them that those costs are necessary and worthwhile, because it won't be the council paying for it, they'll be making a contribution. Now, we're working through all that. The council officers tend to look to BES and BES-related organisations to look for grants. Is there an opportunity for working more directly with not just business, but some of the finance institutions to find ways of assisting the speed and activity in that field? And many others in local government.
Thank you, Peter. And this is a really brilliant topic. And as a former resident of Wandsworth, I think the council have done some pretty impressive things in the past. But so two parts to the answer. So the first is that for me, so much of the answer lies in local. I mean, you sit in Westminster and you make these policies and then you wonder why things are happening. But if you take EV rollout, I'm sure everyone is going to buy an electric car next, but there is still the challenge of where are you going to charge it, particularly in urban areas, and the actual street by street delivery of EV charging, and then the charging hubs. This is a micro local issue, as you will know, as is the question of greening up housing, as is the question of of better waste management and recycling. And if I can be really very honest, I mean, you might look to BEIS, and BEIS will come out with some things like the regional energy hubs that we funded. Yeah. But there is a nasty disconnect between BEIS and whatever it's called now, local communities and local government, DCLG, M8, whatever. These just don't talk very well together. And I remember the struggles trying to get sort of combined heating and power networks, which can be a very good way of decarbonising. There's just a disconnect. So my advice to local councils is to pull any lever you've got through delegated powers currently. So, for example, I didn't realise councils can specify tree cover in new developments. They can be extremely bold about saying we'll approve this thing, but we have to have 20% forest cover, and by the way, we want it for 5 years. Don't just plant the little saplings and have them die. And then I was told this, and I was, we can't do that. The planning inspectors. I said, well, High Wycombe Council's doing it now. So my advice would be look at the delegated powers you've got and aggressively use them. But also, as a conservative council, make the point that particularly in areas like Wandsworth, where you've got, political challenges, that the government needs to start giving you some more resource to do it, because it was the case that we slashed the budgets, which meant that many councils got rid of their experts in this space. You're probably running with 2 or 3 officers who are experts. And for me, it's just a no-brainer that there should be more investment coming through. So I think it's a good political opportunity to say we need more local investment, because we can actually deliver a lot on the ground. And then the final point, sorry, I'm rambling, but I would also go after your big corporate tenants. So to the extent you've got big corporate tenants there, you've got financial institutions, get them involved. And then finally, the Green Finance Institute, set up by wonderful Sir Roger, under its current leader, Rhiannon Thomas, is very interested in these very local solutions, how to roll out, for example, green mortgages in particular areas. So I think there will be many other institutions who would like to be in that conversation with you.
Thank you very much indeed. Elaine Robinson after Elaine John Burris.
Hello, thank you very much for a most interesting talk. When I was in Dubai in 2004, they said they had 18 years of oil left, As fossil fuels are finite, have we any means of knowing when they'll run out?
It's a great question because it depends on the price. So I remember reading Half Gone. Do you remember all those books we read in the 80s about, you know, that peak oil question? Nobody could have predicted, for example, the shale gas development in the States, which basically gave the States energy independence within 10 years, which was extraordinary. And change the whole conversation about gas. So, and of course, as the oil price goes up and down, then, you know, explorations will happen. Bizarrely, what's very interesting at the moment is you've got investors dumping fossil fuel stocks. So one of the things we'll all be exposed to is the divestment argument that we must stop investing in companies, particularly energy companies that have fossil fuels. The challenge is the demand is not going down. And so when the publicly traded oil and gas companies then don't get capital, get starved of capital and sell assets, the state-owned oil and gas companies buy them. And so what they do is then pump the oil, pump the gas, sell it to the developing world demand, where the demand is, and are much further removed from the influence that shareholders or investors could actually bring. So it's quite an interesting conundrum. But the matter is, Elaine, I suppose nobody quite knows what the fossil fuel reserves are. What they can tell you is in the publicly traded oil and gas companies, how much is priced in at the moment in the various share prices, and it's much more than the current conversations about 1.5 degrees would actually allow to be used.
Thank you very much.
But oil is $75 a barrel in June. I mean, we've got a massive squeeze on oil at the moment. It's quite extraordinary, and so all these signals that we're trying to get there are not resolved because the demand is surging back after COVID.
Thank you. John Bowis and then Martin Barrow.
Yes, when I was in the European Parliament, I was spokesman, amongst other things, on the environment and indeed on development. But we had the Ed Miliband, for example, coming to talk to us because he saw the need to collaborate across party boundaries. And I hope that is something that is being looked at too. In the other direction. But I wanted to ask you about the developing world, because my experience of going to places in Africa is that the issue is not so much coal as wood. And this leads to deforestation and drought and flood, as well as respiratory problems from the indoor unventilated cooking stoves. And I just wonder if you wouldn't agree that this is yet another reason why development aid to obviate these problems is betrayed by current aid reduction policies.
Well, I think that's a very important point, and you know, I believe it's 800 million people who rely on wood as their primary source of energy, and often it's, you know, you'll have seen it, John, little girls and women going out to gather bits and pieces of fuel to then squat down over a charcoal stove, which is terrible in so many ways. And development aid, look, I'm a 0.7%, you know, be in no doubt, but I accept that, you know, you can demonstrate numerous times how that money wasn't spent and wasn't spent well in delivery, but that is a execution point, not a strategy point. The challenge is also this, that those countries would be best served in many cases by having some level of gas in their mix, in particular bottled gas for cooking stoves. And again, this is something that is anathema to many of those in the commentariat. But here's the thing: after the Glasgow COP, the COP is going to Africa, and the countries who would like to host it, we know, are Egypt, Ethiopia, and possibly Ghana. That is when the conversation you're talking about needs to happen, which is how do we get 800 million people out of poverty and out of burning biomass in the cleanest, quickest possible way. And it is not waiting until there is 100% renewable energy source and a grid system that works in Africa. I think that is not the right way to position it. So your arguments are very powerful, and I think next year, assuming the next COP happens next year, will be the time to really hear them.
Thank you. I'm going to call Martin Barrow and then Liz Spencer, whom that will be the final question. Martin.
Claire, thank you for that. I spent 35 years in East Asia. I was an MP for 7 years in Hong Kong, not here. and have followed this subject over a great many years. And obviously, bringing together everybody for COP26 and so on is critical. I call it, just like COVID, the need for tech. T, teamwork, E, engagement, C, collaboration, and H, harmony. It's a great opportunity to pull the world together properly for this. And it's critical in East Asia that we break the silo mentality, pull everybody together. So it will have great political plus points. But in parallel, I think there's a great need. We've got to make sure in the UK, we get a clear message out that we are open and welcoming to investors, students, and tourists. And we mustn't get deflected away from that. Global Britain as a branding doesn't have a meaning in Chinese or Japanese. You've got to say clearly, we're open and welcoming. And none of this should inhibit that, nor just like post-Brexit, it shouldn't be. We've got to all work together on this. Would welcome your comments.
Well, thank you. And I defer to your experience, and I very much like the analogy. And you're absolutely right. I was sort of trying to allude to this. That it's the ultimate tragedy of the commons, and no one solution or no one group are going to solve it. There is no magic bullet. There's no people say, what about if we had one child policy? Well, that's just not going to. This is just ridiculous. We don't have a single, and that's unfortunate because this is so complicated. I suppose the one thing I would say, and it relates to, I saw there was another comment posted about this, about the sort of the implication post Brexit, and as someone said, the kind of trumpeting of trade policies that don't have climate, is that this is, the government's moved away from the climate agenda. I guess I'm really interested in the politics of it, and because you do have, the Prime Minister has to some extent drunk the Kool-Aid on environmentalism, although his interest is much more in sort of nature protection. But you have got sensible people, including Kwasi Kwarteng, who genuinely understand this, and I think understand the importance of delivering this, and also understand the opportunity for Britain to be seen as a global leader. David alludes to the very difficult cabinet meeting we had, where I persuaded Philip Hammond to cough up £250 million to be the COP host, which, as you might imagine, is not easy. But part of it was, look, if we're serious about a post-Brexit agenda that is global, and B, playing to a position of strength. I mean, the UK has cut its emissions more than any other developed country since 1990. I mean, this is the truth of it. So there is a position of strength, and they did sort of get it. So my hope is that as we stop feeling the need to wrap ourselves in a union flag and ignore everything else, that this will emerge. And of course, COP, and this is where the role of all of you in your conversations and your public commentary about, well, if we're serious about delivering this COP outcome, we have to show how we're prepared to work together, is so incredibly important.
Thank you.
Thank you. Liz Spencer.
Claire, I recognise your observations about the roles of bureaucrats in COP, because I've been involved in the COP since Kyoto.
Oh, I wasn't being insulting.
No, it wasn't meant. I wasn't taking it like that, but I recognise I have been at most COPs since Kyoto. My question to you is a simple one. This is one of those issues that requires governments to make short-term decisions that are painful for their electorates for long-term gain.
Yes.
And this seems to me to be an impediment for many years. Do you sense that, democratic governments, I should perhaps add, that this is becoming more open to resolution?
Well, I think so. If you are to believe that we will achieve the decarbonisation targets that we're all putting forward, so the UK has just put forward a target that suggests we'll have cut carbon from 1990 levels by 78% by the middle of the next decade. That is extraordinary. And if you think that we've basically decarbonised the energy system pretty dramatically, to do that will involve dramatically changing the way people travel, how our homes look, what heating we can choose, what food we eat. I think we're going to see an intrusion into the political space. And I don't know if others remember that there was a trial balloon floated of putting a tax on meat in the UK to reflect its. I think, by the way, that's nonsense, because actually extensively grazed meat is quite good for certainly very good for biodiversity. So it's quite a nuanced argument. But you're quite right. We're going to have to start to get into people's spaces in a way that is uncomfortable. And can it be done? Well, the UK had its citizens' assemblies. We went through this process led by the select committees of actually having citizens' assemblies on climate. And the findings were fascinating because, selection of people who didn't necessarily, were all across the spectrum politically and attitudinally. And they coalesced around some sensible things like, yes, we are prepared to pay more to fly, but we're not prepared to pay more for food, I think was, I can't, but so there was sort of a consensus. The assumption is that, the sort of next generation will take us forward and therefore this will become easier. And I just think we're going to see, particularly in France, the Gilets Jaunes protest was slightly about this process. I think we're going to see some really big challenges. The other thing I would say is, again, vegetarianism fascinates me because now sort of 70% of people in the UK say they're trying to eat less meat, and some of them are going, strongly vegan, annoyingly, including one of my children. That has come out of nowhere.
Don't you want to take out our guest border?
Well, it's quite depressing having to cook for the family, but that's come out of nowhere. That huge, you go to M&S now and you see the number of the vegan and vegetarian spaces, and that has emerged almost from nowhere. And some of that is about climate consciousness. Some of it's about wanting to do better and just be a better person. And I think that sort of attitude can help drive some of this progress. Got a little one joining us too, a little generation person is joining us.
Not quite voting next generation.
Well, remember what Loyola said, Claire, can I say thank you very much indeed for leading, I think, what's been a very stimulating discussion. And it's so good to have a conversation amongst colleagues that just gets away from the sort of Yabu, no you did, no you didn't, yes I did type of debate that I think just disfigures so much of the way politics is reported these days. Indeed, I'm afraid, I look at the current House of Commons to some extent how it's done as well. And I think neither you nor anybody who contributed to the conversation underestimated the challenge, and we wish you well as you continue to work on this. Could I say that anybody who is not a member but would like to join the CEF, please do so using our website, conservativeeuropeanforum.com. The 6th of July is our annual general meeting, when I look forward to introducing our new president after Ken Clark's decision to step down, and all members can register to attend via the CEF website. You do have to be a member in order to register to come to that. And the other date for your diary is the 6th of September, this year, when Ken Clark will be giving his valedictory speech. We've deferred that quite deliberately, both because we really want, if humanly possible, for this to take place when we can meet Ken again in person, rather than just on a screen. And secondly, because as Ken himself is always the first to say, he is not renowned for his friendliness towards digital technology when it comes to communications. So he would much prefer to do this in person, and I think everybody who's known and loved Ken will look forward to that meeting. Thank you very much again, Claire. Thank you to everybody else who took part, and I formally declare the meeting over.
Thank you. Thanks again.
Thanks, Claire.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.